Seed oils have become one of the most controversial ingredients in modern nutrition, demonized by influencers, questioned by headlines, and even replaced by butter and beef tallow at some fast food chains. But what does the actual science say? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies behind living a longer, healthier, and more purposeful life. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, with my co-host, Corbin Bruton. In this episode, we explore the seed oil backlash, the evolving science around fats, and what really matters when it comes to your health and aging well.
The Aging Well podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical or mental health advice. Dr. Armstrong is a PhD exercise physiologist, and no doctor-patient relationship is suggested. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.
Hey, Dr. Armstrong, recently there's been a lot of chatter online and even policy shifts around seed oil. What do you think is driving this controversy?
It's a good question. I think there's a lot of things that are really driving it. One is you have a lot of these social media influencers and wellness figures that have, on one hand, vilified seed oils, calling them toxic. And then on the other hand, you have people that are really in support of it. And there's a pretty decent balance in terms of the literature that is out there. You see political figures like Health and Human Services Secretary Robert Kennedy Jr. He's really amplified this message. He's pretty anti-seed oils. And in turn, you're starting to see a lot of restaurants, and one in particular was Steak and Shake that recently moved back to using butter and beef tallow in starting to branding it as taking back health. And so there's a lot of controversy out there. And it's really an issue that's less about evidence and more about what's become more of a cultural sentiment. There's a lot of distrust in institutions. We're also seeing a lot of dietary nostalgia where people are kind of pushing back against many of the dietary changes that we've seen over the last several decades. What are your thoughts on what's going on?
Well, I actually am a believer. You can call me a conspiracy theorist or whatnot, but I do believe that there are a lot of seed oils that we have in our lives that do impact the body in some way, whether it's inflammation, whether it's endocrine disruptors. I believe that seed oils can be detrimental, but with that also being said, there are certain oils that it may not be that bad. You know what I mean? So there's also literature out there that says that olive oil can be detrimental when it hits a certain temperature. Like you're not supposed to cook with olive oil at a certain temperature because the thermal threshold isn't that high.
That's really true for all oils. And that's what we want to dive into today is a little bit more of the science behind these arguments, because again, a lot of this is based on emotions and like you said, conspiracy theory. I mean, it's important for our listeners, our viewers, and us as hosts to be addressing this scientifically and addressing it from the evidence that's out there and from a reasonable approach to what is healthy and what is practical for aging well.
All right, man. Well, before we get too far into the weeds, can you explain what seed oils are and how they differ from other oils?
Yeah. So, obviously seed oils come from plants, and we see them coming from plants like soybeans, corn, sunflower, canola oil. Those are all considered to be seed oils. These are oils that are rich in polyunsaturated fats. So we see them being especially heavy in the omega-6 fatty acids like linoleic acid. And we'll get into a little bit more about omega-6 versus omega-3 and where that kind of factors into the whole argument. But seed oils have a high preference for cooking oils. So seed oils have a high smoking point. You mentioned olive oil not being good for cooking. I don't think that's really a scientific study. That's just a practical cooking approach that most chefs will tell you that, you're not going to be frying things in olive oil. It's just not an appropriate oil for frying things. And frying requires a very high heat. So when we have high heat cooking methods like frying, sauteing, roasting, seed oils are more appropriate for this because they're able to add flavor and richness to the dishes. Now, again, that doesn't mean that they're healthy. And I would, argue early on in today's conversation that we should be trying to avoid fried foods. And if we're avoiding fried foods, then the whole argument about whether to fry in beef tallow or corn oil is no longer really an argument because we're eating healthier by eating baked, broiled, those kinds of meats and foods instead of frying things. Get an air fryer to make your French fries and you don't have a problem there. As well, I would probably make the argument, should you be eating French fries in the first place? So there's different from fruit-based oils like olive oil and avocado oil and more tropical oils like coconut, which, by the way, coconut oil is a high saturated fat. But again, these are typically used in cooking oils. They're a little bit better for salad dressings, which, again, I would argue probably olive oil is a little bit better when you get into something that's not being cooked, so it's salad dressings. And I think the big issue when we start looking at these seed oils is how they are used in processed foods and the issues that come along with that.
Okay, let's just dive right in. Let's talk some more. Because there are a lot of critics that often say that seed oils are inflammatory or unnatural. What the heck's going on there? Is this scientific base or is this just an opinion bias,
Well, that's a challenge because when you look at the evidence, it's on both sides of the argument. And there's not any solid evidence to support that it's necessarily inflammatory. The whole idea of it being unnatural, these are natural oils. They're in foods. It's not like they're being processed made in a lab. It might be processed kind of in a laboratory. And then there are, a little bit different processes that are involved in extracting the oil from the vegetable or the plant base. But let's first kind of look at what linoleic acid is. That is the acid that is in seed oils. This can convert to arachidonic acid, which is involved in inflammation. And it's important to realize, too, that inflammation is a very broad term. There's inflammation that is essential for tissue repair, the acute inflammation that, we find in muscle damage that occurs with exercise. So that needs to be repaired. Well, arachidonic acid plays a very critical role in that in terms of producing prostaglandins that are both pro-inflammatory and anti-inflammatory. And so they kind of balance. It's a very important process for tissue repair and muscle hypertrophy. So arachidonic acid is necessary in the body in certain situations. Where it becomes more of an issue is where it is we have the more chronic inflammation. And that's where some of the belief that linoleic acid and seed oils can have an effect of increasing our chronic inflammation. The thing to consider, though, is that how that is measured is a bit questionable. I've seen, scientists that have talked about how, we measure it in the blood, but we don't really measure it in the tissue. And it's a very hard thing to kind of wrap our heads around. But the most important thing to really consider is that the conversion of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid is really minimal. And most of the arachidonic acid that is going to come from animal products, not seed oils, which is quite interesting, when we really are kind of pushing that whole inflammation thing. So part of the inflammation argument might be, the amount of fat in general that we are having in our diets. And there have been multiple studies that show that linoleic acid doesn't significantly increase inflammatory markers. and in some cases may even show anti-inflammatory markers. So one of the real issues that needs to be talked about is not so much about what's in the oil, whether there's omega-6 or omega-3 or whatever. The real issue is probably that we have an imbalance in too many omega-6s and too few omega-3s. When you look at the studies, the thing that really sways whether omega-6s are damaging or beneficial is looking at it in respect to the amount of omega-3s that we are actually getting in the diet. As omega-3s and omega-6 fatty acids are both essential polyunsaturated fats, that means that our bodies can't produce them, so we need to get them in our diet. And they differ primarily in their chemical structure and their effects on the body. So we know that omega-3s are pretty much known for their anti-inflammatory properties. They're well known to have benefits for health or rather heart and brain health. But the omega-6s are, though also essential, can produce more of a pro-inflammatory effect when they're in excess. And so that may contribute to health issues if they're not balanced appropriately with omega-3s.
So what I'm thinking right now is I'm recalling back when we interviewed Dr. Farrow, as far as almost anything we eat has an impact on our body. Now, we may not recognize it, but there is something that is happening on a lower cellular level that there could be inflammation there. Do you think that the seed oils have more of an impact on that microcellular inflammation than, say, beef tallow or ghee would?
I'm not really following your questioning there.
How you're saying that there's a lot of literature out there, but there's no evidence that seed oil really impacts or causes inflammation.
No, there's evidence that it does, but there's also evidence that it doesn't. What I said was it really depends a lot on that balance with the omega-3s when you look at the literature. And the literature is not entirely complete. It's been, decades of studies that have not been really well formulated, well designed. And so we're basing a lot of this decision off of poor information. And the same goes for animal fats. I mean, you look at nutritional science studies, they're very susceptible to bias, whether intentional or not. If the studies are not really, really well designed and we're not measuring what we intend to be measuring, or, we're measuring on one hand what we want to measure, but the other side isn't quite getting a fair analysis, then it really leaves us kind of with a lack of information.
Well, and then we've talked about the importance of omega-3s on this podcast. We actually had a specialist that had come on, and they talked about the benefits of supplementing omega-3s and how just take omega-3s and you can even watch your liver heal itself. So there are a lot of benefits of taking omega-3s, but I don't know if they'll counterbalance the seed oil. Even if
Why not?
proper, I don't know. I don't know. I don't have enough information on that. I feel like,
see, that's the problem is we're basing a lot of these decisions on not having enough information.
Well, totally. And I think that's why this is a good conversation to have. It's a hot topic right now. And I think if we could provide information to individuals, we can either spark something in them to do their own research, or hopefully we can provide a much better approach on the topic,
Okay. Well, let's kind of keep moving forward because, again, I think it's important that we give it a balanced analysis of really what is going on. And I would probably make an argument as well that the whole idea of supplementing omega-3s is a little bit over the top as well, especially because we can get these oils through our natural foods that we eat. And so it's much more about eating a diet that is going to be more balanced in regards to omega-3s and omega-6s as opposed to taking a pill. Because most of the supplements that are out there when it comes to omega-3s are not really that valuable. because they're capsules that are sitting on a shelf for a long period of time. They're much more likely to get rancid. They're much more likely to lose their effectiveness over time. And for many people who are spending a lot of money on omega-3 supplementation, if they're not buying the right product, they're wasting a lot of money. And again, we can get these oils through our diet.
Totally.
If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
Yeah, well, almost, I feel like we're getting too much of those oils because, living in a Western culture where you don't always have the luxury of, cooking your meals. Now, most of us will meal prep, but some people just want to grab and go. And even those healthy option of those granola bars even have seed oil in them. So part of me thinks, I feel like we're taking in way too much of the seed oil. The seed oil intake versus the omega-3 intake doesn't really balance each other out.
Well, again, that's a diet issue, not necessarily an issue of the type of the oil. It's what kind of foods are we eating, and how are these things processed, and how much fat are we actually consuming in our diet, and when are we consuming that fat in?
Oh, gotcha. Okay, so what about the processing concerns? People are worried about the hexane and refining. What would you say about that?
For those that might not know what hexane is, it's basically what is used in the oil extraction. So it's a little bit different when we got the seed oils. You can't just squeeze a seed and get the oil out. With an olive, avocado, you're basically pressing the fruit and getting that oil out. Hexane is a process that's used in oil extraction that generally it only presents maybe a small trace of non-toxic amounts. So it's what is used in the processing is probably lower than we're breathing in on a daily process. Now, one hand, what this processing does is it allows for an improved shelf life and, again, improving the smoking point so that they're better for frying and cooking. But yes, it does strip some of the nutrients. There are some cold pressed options that are available for some of these oils, but that generally makes the oil much more expensive, and it also makes it less heat stable. So this is a real concern, but I think to a greater extent, it is very much overstated. What are your thoughts?
I just think it's really weird with like canola oil is vegetable oil, and I don't know that many vegetables that have oil in them. Like when I eat when I think oil, definitely from peanuts, you can feel it on your fingers. I don't really know.
So if they don't have oil, then where are they extracting them? If the plant itself does not have the oil, what do you think? It just magically appears, dude? Come on.
You know what? I don't know.
If they can extract the oil, there is oil in it. I mean, corn has oil. A lot of vegetables, soybean. So there are oils that just need to be extracted. So there is a certain amount of fat in foods that we eat, and that's another reason, it's like if I can eat the vegetable and that oil is in it, then am I not getting the omega-6s, omega-3s that my body might need to be able to make your arachidonic acid or linoleic acid?
Yeah, you're probably also getting more, vitamins and minerals to actually absorb everything as well. So you're not just getting a concentration of that omega-6. You're probably getting everything, like you were saying. If you're just eating a more natural way and you're eating the vegetable by itself, it's going to be way better than the actual oil.
Right.
So I guess what I want to know is, does the science support the health claims against seed oil?
I think I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, that there is decades of research that has shown that replacing saturated fats with unsaturated fats, like those in seed oils, can lower LDL cholesterol and reduce the risk of heart disease. And the American Heart Association for many, many decades has recommended more polyunsaturated fats as opposed to saturated fats. There have been meta-analyses that have been done that have shown about a 30% reduction in heart disease, which is comparable to statins. But again, with that argument that it's comparable to statins, when you really look at the statin evidence, how much do statins really reduce heart disease is pretty minimal as well. I think I heard a statistic that statins maybe add 3 days to your life if you're prescribed statins. So again, it is a rather insignificant difference. I think there's many other factors and variables that contribute to heart disease and our risk of heart disease. And it's the combination, as we'll talk about it, the oils with the other products that we are consuming them with. But there is a lot of newer research that is exploring saturated fat in whole foods. But because there's research being done and there is some evidence one way or the other, this doesn't necessarily mean that seed oils are harmful. And I think it's important for us, as responsible scientists and educators, that we emphasize that demonizing one ingredient really oversimplifies the complexity of dietary patterns. What are we eating? Changing one small thing can have some effect, but it's really not that big of effect if there's all these other negative factors in our diet. And so we really need to consider the broader sense of how seed oils fit into the Western, the American diet.
So with the crave of, social media and all these trends, and there's a lot of people we even respect, that say that seed oil is bad. It's not necessarily seed oils are evil per se, but it's more of the processed food that they're in. Is that a fair point?
Yeah, the processed food they're in or how we're using them in our diets. If we're frying a lot of food and we're getting a lot of omega-6s because we're using the seed oils, then that throws that balance out between the omega-3s and the omega-6s. We're getting extra amount of fat in the diet. We're typically consuming it along with carbs that are not the healthiest of carbs. How often do you have people frying broccoli? I don't know of any, unless you're breading it and all that. And then you're making the food worse by, adding a lot of other things to it. Now, if you're occasionally using a little bit of vegetable oil to, say, stir fry vegetables, if you're going to stir fry, you need a certain amount of oil in that to keep it from sticking to the pan. Using a limited amount and using it in the right circumstances is probably not that harmful to our health. It's where we are consuming massive amounts of it that make it unhealthy. And even if we make the argument that, animal fats are the healthier of fats to go with, consuming large amounts of animal fat, with the exception of being in a ketogenic diet where you're making probably healthier fat choices, it's not a healthy approach to living. We're better off eating more vegetables that are not fried, maybe steamed, as opposed to having an argument whether or not we should be cooking those vegetables in seed oil or animal fat.
So how would you explain, say you and your wife, you guys go out for a date night and you're going to either a Chinese or Japanese restaurant where they're utilizing a lot of stir fry, they're using that sesame oil. And then, oh man, you're eating it, everything's good. And then the next morning you wake up and you're like, dude, I am swollen. I'm so puffy. How would you explain that effect?
Well, it doesn't happen to me.
Oh, it doesn't?
So, no, I don't get all puffy eating Chinese food. And so maybe, this is where when we're making decisions about dietary science, we have to factor in the individual. I was listening to a episode of the Huberman, Andrew Huberman's podcast recently, had a nutritionist on there, and he was a nutritional scientist, and he was talking about the studies that were done. In so many of these studies, when they are really well constructed, you're not going to see any results because you have people who are going to respond one way and people who are going to respond the other way, just because that's how their systems are. Some of that might go into our genetics or epigenetics. Some of it might just be our own dietary history. Like for myself, if I eat Chinese food, it's not that I'm going to get all bloated and puffy and everything from eating it. I am going to have a GI response that is rather quick, and it's generally much more associated with the pork products that are cooked along with the foods that I might be eating. And so everybody is an N of one when it comes to nutritional science. And you may have somebody you put on a certain diet, they're going to gain weight, somebody else is going to lose weight. You may have somebody who has a very negative response to seed oils, other people that maybe don't. So our bodies respond differently. Now, if you have an inflammatory type of disease, or if you are, under conditions of a lot of stress, which a lot of Americans are, and that chronic stress is elevating the inflammation in our body, then limiting those seed oils is going to be much more critical than somebody who doesn't have those issues. And so not all oils are the same, just like not every individual that's consuming that oil is going to be the same. And we have to also consider the circumstances under which we are consuming the oils. How is it being used? How much are we using? And that kind of stuff.
I'm glad you mentioned not all oils are the same, and not all specific oils are the same. I just found out that there's some weird marketing scheme in America that depending on what olive oil brand you get, you may not be getting pure olive oil. You may just be getting olive oil that's like cut with canola oil, or you may be getting olive oil that has a different type of seed oil in it. And the best approach is to look for the olive oils that are in the glass bottles that have the Italian flag on there. That apparently is a pure form of olive oil. So I don't know. I don't know if that's a marketing scheme. I don't know if that's real, but
it's not a marketing scheme. That's just a dishonesty scheme amongst manufacturers. Yeah. And so, it really is just knowing the brands that you're buying, looking for really that extra virgin olive oil. I don't know that it makes a difference whether it's in a glass bottle or a plastic bottle, although I think I would lean more into glass just simply because, it is better for our bodies. We're not getting the plastic in our system.
Microplastics.
And that's a whole nother podcast. But yeah, I think when you're buying olive oil, you want to buy a better quality. And so if it's too cheap, then it might be a little bit of a red flag. Now, is it really that big of an issue other than the fact that you're being deceived by the manufacturer, that you have a little bit of seed oil cutting that olive oil? It might not really be, you're looking at the literature, it may not be that significant, but you shouldn't be getting ripped off by a company. If they put on the label that it's an olive oil, vegetable oil mix, then it's your choice whether it's going to be suitable to your purposes or not. It's probably not going to be that big of an issue.
Okay, so I want to hear your take now on replacing seed oils with butter, lard, ghee, or beef tallow even.
That's a step backward. These swaps are going to raise LDL cholesterol and heart disease. I don't think they're the healthiest of oils. Whole food, saturated fats, especially when we look at like dairy and dark chocolate, those may be okay, but how we approach the appropriateness of certain oils is going to be due to their food matrix.
What do you mean by food matrix?
Well, food matrix refers to the complex arrangements and interactions of a food's components. So that includes things like the nutrients, the non-nutrients, the physical structure of the food, which all these things can help influence how the food is digested, absorbed, and metabolized. So it encompasses not just the individual components of the food, but also how it is all structured and how these interact with each other on a molecular level. And so this interaction is what impacts our body and how our bodies utilize the nutrients that are in the food. So it's important to kind of consider what are we getting the oil in and how is it interacting with the other components of that food item. as we're consuming it. But the idea of, using animal fats as cooking staples, I personally don't think it's ideal, especially for aging well. Again, it's added fat. It's unnecessary fat. It's adding calories to our foods, which, we're much better off cooking in no fat versus cooking in fat. And again, you can make that argument that, refining fats as cooking staples, that, that's healthier than seed oils. Again, you can make arguments the opposite way. I think there is a fair amount of evidence that saturated fats are not ideal for us. But, again, we can make this argument back and forth, and you have both ends of the spectrum in terms of, you have people who are on a much more ketogenic diet where they just eat butter on the stick, and to me, what's the point? I mean, there's healthier, more nutritive foods that we can eat. And if the more of our calories are from fat sources that are on either end of the spectrum, the purely animal fat to pure seed oil fats, there's probably a pretty solid argument that it's not the healthiest approach. Again, if we can stick to, when we are using oils, to using more of the healthier omega-3 polyunsaturated fats, olive oil, avocado oil, those types of oils, getting our, fats more from fatty fish as opposed to fatty beef, are probably going to have much better health outcomes for us.
All right. Well, respectfully, I kind of disagree just a little bit. I think if we're going to stick with a more natural approach and more natural foods, I do think that sticking with more of the fats and using those as a staple, I personally think they're a little better. Now, again, don't overindulge in them, but one, there's a lot of literature out there that talks about how our whole endocrine system actually runs on fat, like good, healthy fat. And I think that we can get that from, butter, ghee, even beef tallow. I also feel like the previous generations before us, that's all they had. And if you look at them and you look at their diet in comparison, if you look at someone who is 35 in today's day and age versus someone who was 35 back in the 50s, it's almost like a completely different human being. It just is night and day. People look different now than they ever have back in the day. And I do think it is a small portion of being less active, but I think it's a bigger portion of our diets and what we're taking in. And if we can get back to more of a natural, animal based with whole vegetables, whole fruits, whole meats, I really think it would be good. I know me personally, I've been, I kind of cut back on using olive oil and actually using like ghee, grass-fed ghee. And I just use like a teaspoon when I cook my eggs in the morning. Man, the eggs are so flavorful and it just tastes better. And I don't know if it's a placebo effect, but I actually feel better throughout the day. That's just my hot take on that.
Okay. Well, one thing that we do not do on this podcast is base our decisions on, I feel this. We want to be science-based, evidence-based. And like I've been saying, there is always an N of one. I don't, you said that, how different people look, 50s versus today. I think it's interesting, you see more and more of these like memes on social media where they show actors from like the 70s, 80s. And so versus now, this is somebody who, an actor, popular actor, and I'm not even going to pull out any names, but, an actor from say the 80s that was like 55 when they were in a particular part. And then here's somebody 55 today and they look much, much better. That doesn't have any effect on with regards to the fats that they were consuming. And in fact, back in the 50s, yeah, they might have been using a lot more animal fat. I mean, I remember growing up, my mother would, save the bacon fat in a little jar on the stove. And, when you'd fry eggs and stuff, put it on. Yeah, it tastes better, but is that healthy? It's not a matter of whether it's healthier than using seed oils. The fact is we're still using a significant amount of oils and we're still frying food. That is probably not the healthiest choice in either situation. And so, if we're going to make an argument for or against seed oils or animal fats, there has to be evidence to support that decision. And I'm saying right now, there's not a significant amount of evidence on either side. And so I am not going to make a decision based on what it feels like or how I maybe perceive the influencers on social media and that kind of stuff. I'm going to make the decision based on the available evidence. And I would say that if you're going to really go based on the evidence, the greatest amount of evidence supports eating foods that are going to be higher in omega-3s and those sources coming from more fruit-based fats like avocado, olive oil, maybe coconut oil if you're going to go with some tropical oils. Olive oil or coconut oil is a little bit more on the saturated fat side. That is probably the healthier option. Is there anything necessarily wrong with cooking in beef tallow? Probably not, as long as, again, you're not consuming an excessive amount of fat. And on the other side, occasional seed oil, because it's going to give a different flavor to the food that we are cooking, that's not a big issue either. I think probably where the biggest problems come in on either side is, okay, on the animal fat side, it has a much more savory taste to it. Are you going to eat more because it tastes so good? That's not healthy. Or on the other side of the seed oils, if the seed oils give a certain flavor that causes us to want to eat more. I think the biggest issue in the American population that's making us obese, making us inflamed and, contributing to heart disease and neurocognitive disease is not as much the fats that we are consuming or not consuming, but the fact that we are not participating in enough physical activity. We're not eating enough of the other types of foods, getting good fruits, getting plenty of vegetables, eating whole grains, eating legumes, eating the foods that are going to give us a greater, better gut health and the things that are going to help combat the more chronic inflammatory effects in the body. And so those are things that we really need to consider more so than the oils that we are consuming. But again, it's a matter of choice. Just keep your oils and the fat consumption to a much lower level. Then it's less of an issue one way or the other. I think we over process these arguments, I think, a little bit too much. And again, we base it on how we feel as opposed to really what the scientific evidence states. And it may be, you might be right. Animal fats are the healthiest way to go, but, show me the evidence. Don't just tell me that it makes you feel better or that you feel that, maybe this proponent makes a better argument than the other proponent, and I'll see people that make arguments, you got keto versus plant-based. And I see people on one hand that are unhealthy in both sides that don't impress me. And I see people that are very healthy on both sides. And again, it's an N of one. What's going to work best for me? What's going to work best for our listeners and our viewers?
So it almost sounds like with the whole backlash of seed oils, good, healthy, sticking with natural fats because they're more healthy. It kind of just seems like this is more about an ideology rather than science-based. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a $1 trillion wellness market that's profiting from fear. We have people that are selling detoxes. You got people selling omega-3 supplements. You're talking about ancestral fats. And ancestral fats refer to the types and quantity of fats that are consumed by humans throughout our evolutionary history. And I think you kind of alluded to that a little bit, particularly before the advent of agriculture and modern food processing, these fats are often, associated with more traditional diets. So they might include sources like grass-fed animal fats, your tallow and lard, wild caught fish, certain nuts and seeds. And again, we talk about eating a seed versus eating a seed oil, and it's okay to eat a seed, but it's not okay to eat the seed oil. And it just gets a little bit muddied in terms of the arguments. And I think what we're doing is we're trying to make modern adaptations of ancestral diets that emphasize these sources. And, it's good if we are looking at these and focusing on what are heart-healthy omega-3s and polyunsaturated fats. But we have so many of these influencers out there that are making money criticizing seed oils and selling you their alternative. So again, as we make these evaluations, we have to, determine, is this something, snake oil, would that be considered an animal fat? These snake oils that somebody's trying to sell us, are they just trying to profit from our misinformation, or are they selling us something that is beneficial to us? And in the long run, both sides of the argument have profit to be made in convincing you that their side is the better side. And so real nutrition should be context driven and not clickbait. So we want to look at, what is the context in which I am consuming this particular oil? What is it doing to my body? Is it elevating my LDLs? Is it lowering my LDLs? I've heard people that go on keto and more carnivore diets making arguments that their blood chemistries have not been healthier since they started doing the carnivore diet. And maybe it's the case, but does that mean that somebody else with a different chemistry? And again, you talk about ancestral fats. Well, if we have a long history of our genetic ancestors consuming certain foods, that is going to have an impact on how our bodies metabolize certain other foods. You can look at like the Mongolians, for example. This isn't necessarily talking about fats, but the Mongolians are lactose intolerant, and yet their diet is a hugely dairy diet. A lot of cheese and a lot of milk and things like that. And when you get down to the ancestral stuff, that basically tells me that when we're talking ancestrally, we're talking about how individuals are going to respond to nutritional practices or any kind of practice. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but with your example of the Mongolians, don't they also have a different type of cow that produces like the A2 milk, which has more like a higher level of lactase to help combat the effects of lactose intolerance?
True, but again, you're just underscoring my point that it's very circumstantial, very much based on the individual circumstances and a variety of factors contributing to it. We may be very good at consuming and absorbing and utilizing animal fat, but when that animal fat is in products that have high sugars and other processing and things like that, it's just making something good much worse. I think of like Oreo cookies for the longest time. Not that there was anything ever good about an Oreo cookie. I mean, I don't even think they taste that great. But for the longest time, they used lard in those cookies. And, so if that lard, if you're saying it's healthy, great. But consuming that in something that has high sugar, which is very pro-inflammatory, and, whatever other chemicals and non-food items that are in an Oreo cookie, that isn't healthy. And so we have to look at the biggest picture, the big picture of what's going on with the foods that we're eating, and not just having, kind of pissing contests about whether animal fat or seed oils are the healthiest or least healthy for us. we have to be looking at the whole of the American diet, and the whole of the American diet really sucks. And so the argument of seed oils, and I think that was the intent of this conversation, is the whole seed oil controversy really boils down to is the American diet needs to be refined. And by refined, I don't mean kind of the irony of using the word refined. We have to fix it. It needs to be changed to make people healthier.
All right. So for our listeners who are trying to eat well and age well, what should they actually do?
Well, I think the biggest thing is focus on dietary patterns, not on single ingredients. So what are we eating in our overall diet? And it doesn't mean, you can't go out and have some French fries that are fried in, canola oil or something like that once in a while. I would not recommend having French fries a lot. Honestly, I try and avoid them as much as possible, and not so much because of the oil, but just because of the white potato, non-nutritive really components of the average French fry that you're getting out in public. But we want to prioritize whole foods, eating fruits, eating vegetables, eating nuts, seeds, legumes, eating oily fish, so getting our oils from those foods. So if we're eating a whole nut, it's going to be much better for us than eating a nut oil. You mentioned peanut and peanut oil. Which is healthier for me, to eat a peanut, or is it healthier to eat or just kind of drink the, peanut oil? We have certain influencers out there telling us to drink olive oil. What's the point of drinking olive oil? To consume other healthy foods with that oil, and it's better for our overall benefit. And, we want to get healthy fats from a variety of sources, not just one source. You don't want to necessarily just focus in on only olive oil. There's benefits of avocado oil, and difference between the two in terms of cooking can have benefits for us in terms of the flavoring of the foods and the way that it allows us to cook that food. Nuts and yes, seed oils in moderation, but do it with the perspective of trying to improve our overall omega-3 intake, because we know from the literature that omega-3s have a positive effect in terms of limiting heart disease and being more anti-inflammatory. And so the higher ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s is going to give us a better balance of the two. Do we not need omega-6s? Well, our bodies need omega-6s too. And so where are we getting those from? So if we improve our omega-3 intake by eating fatty fish, eating more walnuts, flaxseed, those types of things, that's going to help us a little bit more. And biggest thing I would recommend is avoid ultra-processed foods. And again, not because of just one ingredient, but because they crowd out nutrient-rich choices.
Not to go down too deep in the weeds and too much of a rabbit hole, but don't certain fried foods have omega-9s? Isn't that, and don't the omega-9s like completely negate the omega-3s and the omega-6s altogether? So if an individual is eating, and I could be mistaken, maybe it's not fried. I thought it was only found primarily in like fried food, is where the chemical compounds converts it into an omega-9, which completely negates the omega-3 and the omega-6 effect. But I could be mistaken on that.
Again, either way, you're talking the fried food, right? And so just avoid the fried foods, and it's not an issue, and just eat things that are going to be in a more whole, natural state, and using the oils to kind of supplement that, or you're consuming your oils from the natural foods. Again, if we're eating whole nuts, we're eating avocados, we're eating olives, all that has the oil in it. Do we need to add any more oil to our diet?
So, Dr. Armstrong, how do we navigate all of this confusion and just stay grounded in just the facts?
I think, again, as I've said numerous times, we need to be skeptical of extremes. Anytime somebody says always avoid or this food is toxic, that's not necessarily evidence-based. So there's not always black and white when it comes to the food choices that we make. And we have to really base it in the science, not in the influencers that are telling us to do one thing or another. We want to make sure that we stay curious and stay evidence informed. So don't let fear drive your food choices. Use science wisely. Nutrition science is always evolving, and I think that's a good thing. As long as we're evolving toward a better understanding. If we're evolving, it means we're learning. But the biggest thing I would underscore is just consider balance, consider variety, and consider the context in which we are looking at a particular food, and how is that contributing to the bigger picture? Because when we look at balance, variety, context, these are all what are going to help us to age well.
And remember, aging well is not about living longer. It's about living better.
Yeah. And hopefully we maybe move people just a step or two forward today in looking at trying to age better and keep aging well. Thank you for listening. I hope you benefited from today's podcast. And until next time, keep aging well.